Have you ever discovered something that made you question your entire life? Not a small secret. Not an embarrassing family story. I mean something so shocking that it completely changed the way you saw the people closest to you. Because that's exactly what happened to me. One dusty notebook hidden inside an old wooden chest turned my world upside down. It revealed a secret my mother had spent decades protecting. And according to her own handwritten words, my father wasn't the man he claimed to be. He was a fugitive. A man who had been running from his past for over 30 years. At least, that's what the diary said. And once I started digging for the truth, I realized that some family secrets are buried for a reason. My name is Hannah, and this story began shortly after my mother's funeral. Losing my mother was the hardest thing I had ever experienced. She had been the center of our family, the person who remembered every birthday, the person who called just to check in, the person who somehow held everything together. After the funeral, my father seemed completely broken. He barely spoke. Most days he sat alone on the porch staring into the distance. I figured he was grieving. We all were. A few weeks later, I volunteered to clean out the attic of my parents' house. My mother had always been organized, but she never threw anything away. The attic was packed with decades of memories. Old photo albums, Christmas decorations, boxes filled with letters, school projects, furniture nobody used anymore. I spent hours sorting through everything. Then I found the chest. It was hidden behind several old blankets in the far corner of the attic. A small wooden chest with a brass lock. The lock wasn't secured. When I opened it, I expected jewelry or family photographs. Instead, I found dozens of notebooks. All of them belonged to my mother. They were diaries, carefully dated and organized. At first, reading them felt wrong, private, almost intrusive. But curiosity eventually got the better of me. I opened one, then another, then another. Most entries were ordinary. Family vacations, work frustrations, funny stories about raising children. The diaries painted a picture of the mother I had always known. Kind, thoughtful, loving. Then I found an entry that changed everything. The date was nearly 32 years old, written before I was born. The handwriting looked rushed, almost nervous. The entry began with a sentence I will never forget. If anyone ever discovers the truth about Michael, our lives will be destroyed. Michael, my father's name. Immediately, my attention sharpened. I continued reading. The entry described my mother's fear that someone from Michael's past would eventually find him. It mentioned newspapers, police investigations, a different name, and one word that made my heart stop. Fugitive. I reread the paragraph 3 times. Surely I misunderstood. My father wasn't a criminal. He was the most ordinary man I knew. He coached my soccer games, fixed broken appliances, volunteered at community events. The idea seemed ridiculous. Yet the words were right there on the page. Over the next several hours, I read every related entry I could find. The story that emerged was unbelievable. According to my mother's journals, she met my father when he was living under a different identity. She claimed he had fled another state years earlier after becoming involved in a serious criminal investigation. The diaries never explained exactly what happened, only that he was terrified of being discovered. Terrified enough to abandon his old life completely. I felt sick. Nothing made sense. If the diary was true, then my entire childhood had been built on a lie. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying memories of my father. Every birthday, every holiday, every family photograph. Had all of it been fake? The next morning, I returned to the attic. There had to be more information. Hidden among the notebooks, I discovered an envelope. Inside were newspaper clippings. Most were yellowed with age. One article immediately caught my attention. The headline mentioned a man wanted for questioning in connection with a large financial fraud case decades earlier. The accompanying photograph was grainy, old, black and white. But my blood ran cold when I saw it. The man looked exactly like my father. Just younger. Much younger. I stared at the image for several minutes, trying to convince myself I was imagining the resemblance. But I wasn't. It was him, or someone who looked incredibly similar. For the first time, I considered the possibility that my mother's diary was telling the truth. I decided to investigate. Carefully, quietly. I started with public records. Old newspaper archives. Historical court documents. Anything I could find. The deeper I searched, the stranger the story became. The man in the newspaper clipping had disappeared shortly before authorities planned to question him. Then, he simply vanished. No arrest. No trial. No confirmed sightings. Nothing. It was as if he had fallen off the face of the earth. Around the exact same time my father appeared in our town, using the name Michael. The timeline was impossible to ignore. I felt trapped between two realities. The father I knew, and the man described in the records. Eventually, I reached a point where I couldn't keep the secret to myself any longer. I confronted my father. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening. He was sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee when I placed the diary on the table. At first, he looked confused. Then he saw the newspaper clipping. Everything changed. The color drained from his face. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered one word. "Where did you find that?" The fear in his voice terrified me. I asked him directly. "Is it true?" He stared at the diary, then at the clipping, then back at me, and slowly he nodded. I felt like the room was spinning. My father closed his eyes. For a long time, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than I had ever heard it. And then he told me the truth. 35 years earlier, he worked for a financial company. His employer had been involved in a massive fraud scheme. Millions of dollars disappeared. Several executives blamed lower-level employees to protect themselves. My father was one of them. According to him, he wasn't innocent. But he wasn't the mastermind either. He admitted helping cover up information. He admitted making terrible decisions. But he claimed he never stole money. When investigators closed in, panic took over. Instead of staying and fighting the accusations, he ran. A decision he regretted every day afterward. He changed his name, moved across the country, started over. Then he met my mother. At first, he intended to tell her the truth. But fear kept stopping him. 1 year became 2. 2 became 10. Then decades passed. The secret grew larger and harder to reveal. Eventually, he convinced himself the past was buried forever. Until now, I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt betrayed. Another part felt sorry for him. The man sitting across from me wasn't some dangerous criminal. He was my father. The man who raised me. The man who taught me how to ride a bike. The man who stayed awake all night when I was sick. Yet he had lied to us for our entire lives. For weeks afterward, I struggled with conflicting emotions. Anger, confusion, disappointment, sympathy. Eventually, I decided to verify his story. And that's when I discovered one final twist. The case had been reopened years earlier. New evidence emerged. Evidence that cleared several individuals who had originally been suspected, including my father. Technically, he was no longer wanted. The investigation had long since concluded. Had he stayed and faced the process, his name likely would have been cleared decades ago. But because he ran, he never learned the outcome. He spent 30 years hiding from consequences that no longer existed. 30 years living in fear. 30 years believing the truth would destroy everything. When I told him what I discovered, he cried. For the first time in my life, I saw my father break down completely. Not because he feared prison. Not because he feared exposure. Because he realized how much of his life had been consumed by fear. My mother had known all along. The diaries made that clear. She chose to protect him. Not because she approved of his decisions, but because she loved him. And because she believed people deserved a second chance. It's been 3 years since I found that diary. The secret isn't a secret anymore. Our family knows the truth. And surprisingly, we're stronger because of it. The discovery didn't destroy my father's legacy. It humanized him. It reminded us that people are complicated. They make mistakes. Sometimes enormous mistakes. But those mistakes don't always define who they become. When I think back to that attic, I often wonder what would have happened if I had never opened that wooden chest. maybe the truth would have remained buried forever. Maybe my father would have carried that secret to his grave. But sometimes hidden truths have a way of finding daylight. And sometimes the story you uncover isn't about a criminal. It's about a frightened young man who made one terrible decision. A decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. And it all began with a secret diary hidden in an attic for more than 30 years.